8:45. I see quorum. Our witnesses are in place and all sound checked. Colleagues, for the first hour, we'll go through the normal time frame, and then the second hour, I intend to take a few minutes at the end to pass the travel budget, and hopefully you will use those 2 hours somehow or another, as among yourselves, to arrive at an accommodation as to how this committee will travel. Maybe I live in a world of faint hope, but still. With that, I'm going to call on Kristen Chanfanari to make her 5-minute presentation. Welcome back to the committee. And then Mr. Callan, who apparently is now online and checked, come in by video conference. So with that, we look forward to what you have to say, Ms. Chanfanari.
Make sure this is on. Yes?
Yep.
Good. Good morning.
They will do it for you.
Thanks. Good morning. And thank you again for the invitation to appear before this committee. Today, I'll provide you with the perspective of the Canadian defence and security industry and the subset of companies that make up Canada's cybersecurity industry. Canada's cybersecurity industry is world-class. According to studies carried out by ISET and StatsCan between 2018 and 2020, the sector grew over 30% in terms of employment, R&D activity, and revenue. It's a fast-growing global sector expected to outpace traditional IT in terms of spending. However, only 8% of the sector's revenue is derived from Canadian government contracts. 8%. The sector sells 3 times as much to our Five Eyes allies as it does to the Canadian government. Those numbers speak to a central challenge we face in this country when it comes to cyber. Our allies see more value in Canada's cybersecurity sector than Canada does. Something's wrong with that picture. On one side of the coin is that Canada needs to acquire more from its own industrial base, using procurement as a policy lever to drive innovation and build scale in Canadian businesses. On the other side of the coin is that Canada needs to procure at the speed of cyber. A slow procurement process is a recipe for buying out-of-date or obsolete technology. Innovation cycles in this domain are measured in months, in sometimes weeks. Resolving these issues boils down to one word: collaboration. Canada requires a much greater degree of collaboration, cooperation, knowledge sharing, and co-development between government and the private sector. Some positive steps have been taken towards this, but we're nowhere near where we need to be. While agencies like CSE are very capable, CADSE's research has shown our government is falling behind our allies when it comes to working with the private sector in an institutionalized way. Our allies are collaborating with industry in real time right now in Ukraine. The Canadian government needs to establish a recurring forum for dialogue and discussion on cyber issues with all the key players: industry, D&D CAF, CSE, CCCS, GAC, and public safety at the table. Canada needs improved systems for threat sharing that combine open sources with government and industry sources of information about breaches, indicators, and potential responses. This will mean rationalizing what is unclassified and what remains classified and who has access to what. Again, our allies are on the forefront of this activity. We should consider sandboxes and collaborative lab spaces to test new technologies and capabilities together at scale, and talent exchanges between the public and private sectors like UK's Industry 100 program and a new talent exchange just launched by CSE. That could start to address the cyber talent shortages we're all facing, because cannibalizing each other isn't going to work. Reservists with cyber and computing skills that are employed by companies could be an attractive way to support reconstitution of the CAF, so long as the government does not claim the IP and patents that reservists create while employed in the private sector. It's also important to note that the broader defence industrial base, or DIB, which includes companies making everything from satellites to ships, has become a prime target for cyber threat actors. Companies are increasingly incorporating technologies like artificial intelligence into their products. We know that countries like China and Russia will pursue Canada's AI through all available vectors. Canada's DIB is closely integrated with the CAF and with the American DIB. What we do in this sector is highly valuable, and that makes us vulnerable. given that 90% of the Canadian defence companies are SMEs and many lack the ability to defend themselves against a state-sponsored cyber attack. There's a growing requirement to secure Canadian defence companies large and small. The Americans are, not surprisingly, ahead of us. Very soon, a demanding and mandatory cybersecurity standard will start appearing in Pentagon defense contracts. This is known as Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification, or CMMC. CADSI's argued that Canada should adopt this standard by reference. CMMC will likely become a de facto Five Eyes, if not global, standard for defense firms. Taking time to contemplate a separate standard in Canada could become a competitive disadvantage for us and a non-tariff trade barrier. And while CMMC is new, other regulations need modernization for cyber that needs to be done with industry at the table, since we're at the technological bleeding edge and we own the lion's share of the infrastructure. In conclusion, effective cyber defense at national levels is a team sport. If our allies get this, why can't we? Thank you, and I'll be pleased to take your questions.
Mr. Callan, 5 minutes, please.
Yes. Good morning. I thank the members of the committee for the opportunity to appear before you today. My name is Tim Callan, and I'm the Chief Experience Officer and Chief Compliance Officer at Sectigo, which is a global leader in solutions for digital identity, public key infrastructure, and digital certificates. These are foundational elements in securing digital operations and ecosystems. My experience in this technology space goes back to 2004. I have previously been a vice president and leader at VeriSign and Symantec and a member of the board of directors at DigiCert. I am co-creator and co-host of a popular IT security podcast called Root Causes, which focuses on digital identity, encryption, and PKI. Today, nearly every organization depends on digital processes. Even the most traditional and offline of businesses cannot perform properly without the aid of both customer-facing and internal digital services that depend on complicated interconnected networks of servers, devices, work streams, automated programs, and more. These systems have grown to feed each other in complex webs of interdependency, and consequently, the concept of an isolated system failure is becoming rarer and rarer, replaced instead by cascading failures that can bring down entire sets of services. A perfect example is the multinational cellular outage of December 6, 2018. On that date, approximately 40 million users of O2, SoftBank, and other cellular providers experienced an outage that lasted nearly a day. This owed itself to a single failure of a single system in a single third-party software provider. This failure cascaded outward until eventually the entire data networks for multiple major mobile service providers were unavailable. The specific failure was with a digital certificate, which is a component that proves the identity of one element of a network system. Absent proper digital identity, malicious actors can use a variety of techniques to inject themselves into the system to steal information, take down services, or co-opt processes. Digital identity is irreplaceable for defense in-depth strategies like zero trust network access and passwordless authentication. Digital identity is necessary to securely operate modern IT architectures such as DevOps, public cloud, and Internet of Things. Securing digital identities occurs through public key infrastructure, or PKI. PKI is a time-proven method of exchanging cryptographic keys to verify connected systems and encrypt data. PKI prevents third parties from reading or modifying data in transit and from pretending to be legitimate actors in a digital ecosystem. Most PKI implementations depend on digital certificates, which encapsulate core cryptographic functions in a way that enables essential capabilities such as lifecycle management, human-readable identity information, and automatic expiration. The question before this committee today is how to protect Canadians against evolving sophistication and cyber threats. The events of recent years have shown us time and again that proper and comprehensive use of digital identity is essential to providing secure digital processes across businesses, government, infrastructure, finance, transportation, healthcare, education, and nearly all other walks of life. Unfortunately, significant implementation gaps exist in organizations of all types. They may consist of poor PKI implementation, weak cryptography, or failure to deploy automated certificate management to ensure all certificates are current and correct. These failures can result in service outages or security breaches of every stripe. Plus, the stakes are rising with the advent of quantum computers. Quantum computers will be able to easily defeat more than 99% of the world's encryption. In particular, the RSA and elliptic curve cryptography algorithms will be breakable in many orders of magnitude less time, rendering encrypted data subject to exposure by any attacker with access to a quantum computer. The response to this threat is development of new cryptographic primitives known as post-quantum cryptography, or PQC. New PQC algorithms have emerged from a joint global effort between government, academia, and industry, and standards bodies are now working to incorporate them. The eventual result will be PQC-enabled products from software, hardware, and services providers available for deployment across IT systems everywhere. Government and industry should begin preparing for PQC by inventorying their cryptography, implementing automated deployment and management solutions, and establishing crypto agility. Crypto agility is the ability to monitor, understand, and update all cryptography across all processes and environments now and in the future. The time for this action is today. Thank you.
Madame Gallant, 6 minutes, please.
Digital ID that you mentioned, the certificates, are they just for work, or are you proposing this for everyday Canadians and personal use? And would Canadians be required by government to have them in order to access benefits and services?
So that is a slightly different question. So digital certificates are foundational to every digital process we have. So Canadian citizens are depending on them whether they know it or not. Now, if your question is, should the country demand a digital ID, as is done in a lot of European countries, that certainly is a wave that the world is moving toward. It provides a lot of benefits. It makes it easy to identify that you're real and not spoofed. Used properly, it can make interaction much easier for the average citizen who doesn't necessarily have a computer science degree. These have been used successfully in a number of European countries. There's also a pan-European standard that they call EIDAS, E-I-D-A-S, which is used broadly across the EU and the UK in order to do exactly that. It is a non-trivial effort to establish these kinds of things throughout government organizations, but government is a good place to start.
Okay.
As you see, sorry.
Okay, so it's mainly for industry, but some people use it for personal. Okay, so to Ms. Cianfarini, what are some of the resources your industries have the government does not have and is failing to understand that it doesn't have?
When you're talking resources, I assume you mean both services and product. The challenge right now is that much of certainly within the agencies, the resources are within the agencies, and the products typically have been developed within the agencies. So there isn't a lot of bleed over between where the capability gaps exist and exposure to those capability gaps to the industry, because it's not in the best nature of CSE to expose where it has capability gaps. So that is one of the number one issues, which is we don't know what we don't know. They do not know what we have, and we do not know where their capability gaps exist. However, what I can say is that the industry itself, about 60% of the industry has capability in securing networks and data infrastructure, which generally means we look after mission assurance. Mission assurance can be for networks in threat environments. It can also mean for sensors and assets like planes, ships, and tanks that operate in networked environments like in the Canadian Armed Forces, as well as the infrastructure like the cloud, for example, that the Armed Forces itself uses for its enterprise. We're also very strong in niche areas like encryption and penetration testing and threat monitoring, and the space assets that we maintain, operate, and deploy, such as RadarSat-2, are used for intelligence collection and targeting. So I can tell you what we have. I just can't tell you where the capability gaps exist within the agencies.
Okay, great. That was going to be my next question. In what ways does Canada expose itself to threats when it chooses to outsource to foreign companies as opposed to supporting its domestic infrastructure?
Well, I mean, I think that we are seeing a great movement by countries to secure supply chains. I referenced CMMC, which is effectively a way in which the Americans are looking at securing their entire supply chain. We would say that failure to adopt these kinds of standards or these kinds of methodologies to ensure that you have a secure supply chain is leading to increased vulnerability. We would also suggest that what you want in this particular sector, your best way of ensuring that your vulnerabilities are reduced in this particular sector is to employ Canadian citizens with Canadian security clearances in Canadian businesses that are paying Canadian taxes that have Canadian supply chains. And that's probably the best way that you can ensure that you would be reducing as much as possible the vulnerabilities.
Why do you think the government supports foreign companies instead of using Canadian industries?
I think the challenge is that it may not be necessarily adopting technologies from foreign countries. I believe that it's investing most of its funds, whether that's funds for resources or funds for technology, into its own organization. So CSC is increasing its resource pool and increasing the software and technologies that it itself creates for its own purposes, which is okay. We're not against that kind of behavior or activity, but what we're saying is that there's a lot more that the private sector could be bringing to the table, and certainly the Canadian private sector could be bringing to the table if we look at this issue holistically. And it's something that our allies have realized quite quickly. In our 2020 report, I believe, we interviewed a number of security experts from other countries, particularly the UK and the US, and they identified that over 50% of their cyber operations now are 50-50 split between contractor and agencies themselves. So they're moving in that direction.
Mr. Sousa, 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you both for your testimony. And actually, Ms. Ciaffarini? Ciaffarini, I apologize. I was really encouraged by your opening comments in respect to Canadian expertise, notwithstanding the fact that Canadians aren't necessarily utilizing them to the same effect as the other allies and the Five Eyes. And I was also struck by your comment that around the supply chain, that the speed of cyber is so fast, it's hard to keep up. So how do you keep up?
Well,
you're a professor in this very issue, in this very space.
Well, I spent a lot of time trying to keep up. I mean, I guess it comes down to having a whole entire industry around me that keeps me informed. So we share information, we share knowledge, and we have to be open to collaborating.
And I think that's part of your solution overall. That's exactly what you're trying to propose that others do in this space, and that Canada take a greater issue about trying to provide some of that sharing. Like when the supply chain risk that you talked about is critical, and when I consider what you're saying, what would then be your most immediate concern?
Well, I mean, there are a couple things. One is securing up that supply chain. Which means, on one hand, adopting regulatory standards as they become available. We are concerned 50% of the defense industrial base exports, and half of those exports go to the United States. So if we want to be a trusted partner in an American supply chain, we will need to be moving in lockstep with them to ensure that we can be trusted partners and that they will be able to procure from us. So that's number one. That's a pressing, almost like economic consideration for us as a country. And the second thing is just the sharing of information on threats. So you would have seen in the papers recently, there have been breaches through the private sector, through critical infrastructure providers or the defense industrial base. We need to ensure that there is a tighter connectivity and sharing of both those breaches in a proactive disclosure manner, and that we can leverage the technologies and agencies in order to get the best protections. So it's that quid pro quo, and it needs to be done in an institutionalized way. It can't be done every time an incursion occurs. There has to be a system that's already in place so that we can draw back on it if and when potentially cyber attacks escalate, which we've seen happening in the theater of war in the Ukraine right now.
Good point. Mr. Callan, did we just reference something around the overarching solution to the architecture alongside private sector? And you talked about the digital issues. Can you elaborate what kind of flexibility alongside our current cyber innovations? Like, how are we keeping up with cyber innovations and working more collaboratively with the private sector to enable success?
So there's a very robust private sector that has a lot of activity in terms of industry standards bodies and cooperative organizations. Again, I referred to the post-quantum cryptography as a great example of this, where people really around the globe came together to build a new architecture that was going to be able to defend against an identified emerging threat. And Canadian companies and academics did play a very important role in that. And I dare say Canadians punched above their weight in this regard, in this particular effort. And, that's really what we need. It isn't, nothing can exist just inside of the boundaries of one nation. The internet is bigger and technology is bigger than any one country. And we need to partner with each other to get the best, because the attackers do. And they don't care about borders. They just care about getting what they want to get. And by working together with other organizations, be it governmental or private, around the world, this is how technology providers can give the very best security posture to enterprises, government, et cetera.
So, Kristen, so it was cited in one of the reports that the manufacturing sector is the most at risk, right? In some of, especially with regards to the supply. And being at Canadian companies are primarily SMEs, and some of this capacity and the critical mass exists in the States and other parts of the world. How do we overcome that?
Well, as we suggested, you need almost like an institutionalized method by which you can create the connections to collaborate between the industry, the private sector, and the agencies or the government bodies. In part, there has been good forward motion being taken by CCCS, so the Canadian Centre for Cybersecurity, which has started to stand up a portion of its organization. There are about, I believe, 6 people right now, but it can probably use a lot more considering the number of businesses that are out there. But it's started to stand up a portion of its organization, which is actually responsible for securing portions of the industrial base. Right now, the focus is critical infrastructure, but as we understand it, they're starting to look at the defense industrial base, which includes the manufacturing component that you're talking about. So it's kind of this slow creeping out of the idea that we need to be engaging companies. We need to be making them more aware to take their responsibility to become more, have more cyber hygiene. And in return for that, we will let those companies into the secret tent a little bit more.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Thank you, Mr.
Thank you
Sousa.
both.
Madame Normandine, 6 minutes, please.
Merci beaucoup aux deux témoins pour votre présence.
Thank you very much to the 2 witnesses for their presentation. I'd like to talk about digital identity and the access of this by government. We even see that there are evil intended external effects for automobile insurance, for example. When in Albania, for example, there was an attack by Iran on the digital government, the first weakest link seemed to be the human being, the player. Is the safety of Canadian users adequate? And do you think, I'd like a few comments too as to the Internet of Things, which might be a backdoor for ill-intended attacks.
Yes, the human being is always a weak link in every digital system. It's very easy to build mathematically pure cryptographic solutions that can't be defeated. It's much harder to teach people not to fall for tricks. We call this social engineering, and it has been going on since before there were computers. And it continues to be a very viable attack. Now, we can build our computer systems to help defend people against these kind of tricks. And you do this with things like cryptography. And by putting that in place, I can actually ensure that it is very difficult or impossible for a worker to give access unwittingly to a criminal, as long as I build the right systems in place. And these are the kinds of things that government and enterprises can pay attention to and can build. And this is one of the areas that we see that enterprises and government continue to be remiss in not doing everything that they're able to do. In terms of the Internet of Things, this is another area where things could be much stronger than they are. We can build cryptographically secure systems that prevent devices from being methods of ingress or possible areas for disruption to our systems, our infrastructure, our manufacturing, our transportation, etc. And once again, we often see these devices do not have the best of breed security. And this owes itself to problems like cost, form factor, size, available power, available bandwidth. And these other factors drive enterprises or drive manufacturers to skimp on security. And the consequences of that are potential attacks. We've seen a lot of them against automobiles. We've seen a lot of them against infrastructure.
Merci, Monsieur Callan. Comme j'ai pas beaucoup de temps, je voudrais aussi pouvoir poser des questions.
As I don't have much time, I'd like to ask a few questions to Ms. Siafrani. The obtention and acquisition of identical identity, some people wanted to apply to the agency, it's a security agency, but it's the RCMP apparently that they should address themselves to. So it's quite ambiguous and unclear as to how we go about it for the average citizen. Could we be a little bit more open, a better cooperation for those who are trying to link public and private sectors? Are our regulations a little too strict at the federal government? Is this what is hindering the cooperation?
Security clearances and classifications. So I can't speak to how the agencies are screening to let in individuals with security clearances. What I can say is that because we face this on the defense file, we take a view in this country that we want the fewest security clearances possible, and we think that clearing less people will make us more safe, meaning the fewer people that have access to that kind of information and knowledge, it will make us a safer country because there will be perhaps less leaks or things like that. Other countries have taken a very different approach now. They're starting to declassify more and more information. We've actually seen that in real time in Ukraine, where the UK government's GCS is declassifying information in real time to show everyone a picture of what is going on. We're seeing that as well in the updated national security strategy coming out of the United States, where they're saying we're going to declassify more information to make the public more aware. So what I would say is that are the lens through which, whether it's screening or whether it's agencies or whether it's the contract security program in this country that does it for national defense, I think the lens, the idea that we need to keep people out instead of bring people in and make them more aware needs to change.
J'aimerais savoir.
Thank you. To what degree that this working in isolation and silos hinders our cooperative effort?
I think it greatly hinders our cooperative effort. We see it on a regular basis within government entities, so D&D CAF to the security agencies to the government. Not to bring in the proceedings of yesterday, but you saw it in real time in foreign interference in the government itself, holistically, between departments, foreign affairs and public safety. We saw it in circumstances in Ottawa in the convoy situation where government agencies, both provincially, municipally, and actually across the federal government, were not harmonized on approaches or information and threat sharing. And we see it, we feel it on our end in the private sector, where very often we're asking ourselves, what is going on? Do we need to be aware? Is the threat increasing or decreasing? So I think our siloed behavior is a hindrance to this country, and it's a shame because we're such a small nation.
We're going to have to leave it there. Ms. Madison, 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks to the witnesses for appearing today. Ms. Ciafarani, did I do it right? Yeah. All right. Phew, there's a lot of pressure on that right now. So you had talked about that institutionalized standards. And of course, we've seen a lot of back and forth. There's been a lot of overall in terms of the idea of procurement between governments not having these longer term, neutral, nonpartisan type plans that have really gotten in the way of what I think you're talking about in terms of what the industry can do, what they can provide, how they can plan themselves, how they can build, especially when they're small, medium enterprises, as you said, is the majority of Canadian businesses. So could you discuss maybe some of the points around the fact that even now, we seem to be shifting yet again. We had a government that went sole source for some procurement projects. Then it was refuted by another government saying, okay, we need an open bidding process. That took a very long time, cost a lot of money. Now we seem to be shifting back to that idea of urgent operational requirements and a lot of procurement projects focusing on that to actually bypass that open source procurement. So can you talk about what that does to the industry overall, both from a cybersecurity perspective, but also in defense procurement overall?
So we've been talking a lot, and this is under the Defense Policy Review, Defense Policy Update, around a concept of continuous capability sustainment or agile procurement. What I can say is there is a time and a place for competition. Typically, nations compete when there are two foreign vendors and there is no Canadian incumbent. That is the normal way in which we see it happen around the world. When there is a Canadian incumbent, and what we're talking about here in this on the cyber side is you would want to have already trusted, curated Canadian businesses that you are prepared to deal with. Then and in those particular cases, sole sourcing is not and should not be viewed as a shortcut to the process. It should be the solution to agility. Where it goes sideways is when you don't understand that most nations use the process of sole sourcing or agile procurement to sustain, maintain, grow their businesses within their own countries. So meaning national security is economic security. They fundamentally understand by investing in a Canadian company and by doing that in an agile way with trusted sources or trusted individuals, we can effectively be investing in our economy.
But wouldn't it be the case then that the larger companies consistently would have, and they already have an edge, but more so would eliminate the ability for those small and medium-sized enterprises to truly compete at the same level?
Well, they don't compete at the same level. Small businesses are generally a part of the supply chain. So there are two ways in which small businesses generally get directed contracts. Either you have a niche technology that is, and that typically gets sought after by agencies in directed, very targeted purchases. or you have platforms or larger projects where you have both a vendor of a thing, like a chip, a plane, or whatever, and that OEM has an entire supply chain. And in those cases, what you want to do is get in on the ground floor in being a supply chain partner, so a trusted partner to those OEMs, which means that you want to position your defense industrial base or your industrial base as players within that supply chain, which is where when we come to the idea of we need to ensure that we're trusted supply chain partners by making sure that we have the appropriate regulations in place so that we don't end up with non-tariff trade barriers. In other words, those OEMs saying, you can't play in my sandbox because you're not certified. That's the way in which we ensure that the smaller business is just get a piece of the action, if you will.
Okay. So, I mean, and we are seeing quite a lot of that within procurement, right? Not one company, or one company can't maybe potentially do it all. So they do outsource all of those pieces. They do try, especially if there are requirements in terms of Canadian procurement, Indigenous procurement, for example, to try and meet some of those percentage standards or what have you. But how, again, can we ensure that those are mainly Canadian, if they're part of, like, they're the puzzle pieces to create the overall larger standard, and that they're not actually just consumed, like we're seeing in the telecom industry, that they're not just consumed by the larger.
It can happen. I mean, you know, there isn't a one size fits all. There are various incentives you can use. So in our country, we have what we would call an offset policy, or an industrial and technological benefit policy, which is applied at the time at which you do procurement. And that incentivizes prime contractors to use Canadian businesses within their supply chains in order to get Canadian government contracts. So you can do those kinds of things. You can also dictate, in terms of your requirements, I want you to work with that vendor because they have that technology. You can specify it in the way in which you do business. And in the case of cyber and agile procurement, what we would argue is that you would already have pre-trusted Canadian firms, and you would simply source directly to them, and that would expedite the process. You already have your trusted partners with the proper classifications that you need, and you would be able to go back to that base again and again.
Thank you, Ms. Madsen. Colleagues, we're again the same problem. I think we're going to try and run a full 25-minute round. We may be chewing into the second hour, but I think it's inappropriate that we do that. So, Mr. Kelly, 5 minutes.
So, in the CATSI report, it's noted that while we take in Canada years and sometimes decades, adversaries and allies both have demonstrated their ability to deploy new cyber capabilities in months or weeks. Just how broken is PSPC?
Well, we're trying to apply a model that wasn't designed for agile procurement to agile procurement. So what we're suggesting isn't that the current model is broken, it's the current model is being inappropriately applied to technology.
So the PSPC model is an inappropriate model for cybersecurity?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So the right. So the urgency is that from your report is rooted in the fact that cyber threats go faster than government decision-making processes. What does the government have to do to be able to actually make timely decisions to protect Canadians in the realm of cybersecurity?
Well, in the model, I mean, time is the enemy. So in our report, you would have seen, and the report you're referring to, I assume, is the 2021 Procurement at Cyber Speed. So page 18, for those of you that have it, it's a good read. But there are really like three things that could be done, which is, you start to create these umbrella projects that procure capability. So like I suggested, you break down those barriers where you have trusted partners. There is a capability development and sustainment that is resident within the country, and you allocate funding at an umbrella level. The other thing that you could do is have more flexible funding. So right now we have a whole approvals process, goes through Treasury Board. There's about 200 steps if you take the old model. You would sort of get rid of all that sausage making, if you will, and you would consider a vote of funding that has the flexibility of like a vote 1 and the ability to acquire new capability of vote 5. And then the last thing you could do is that you can fast track the approval and contracting process by, like I said, where you have, by setting guidelines, which is where you have technology and services made by Canadian nationals with Canadian security clearances in trusted, curated Canadian businesses where taxes are paid in Canada and IP rests in Canada. Boom, I can buy that.
Okay, thank you. A number of years ago, the Government Operations Committee studied procurement by small and medium-sized enterprises. You talked about the differences and how so many vendors in cybersecurity are and cyber defense are in fact small enterprises. The committee heard that small enterprises just they can't cope with the requirements of the current procurement system, and that it is so complicated and so impossible to deal with PSPC that it has become a niche, that only niche vendors whose whole business model is simply figuring out how to game the procurement system, that you have de facto sole source contracting because there's just no competitors. Is that a particular issue within procurement for cybersecurity?
Well, I think you would have heard from the agencies that did do the testimony, which is they effectively don't procure. So I believe what they do is they're looking at that system and they're imagining if we had to apply that system to procuring cyber technology, boy, would that be an impediment, which is why one of the reasons why they potentially don't do it. And so is the system cumbersome, somewhat unwieldy, and is there a whole cottage industry around how to use it? Absolutely. Which is why we're frequently here at the table saying this can be made much better. And particularly for cyber, there are many ways in which it can be made much better and much more agile.
Right, indeed. Okay, would you like to elaborate on recommendation number 4 from your report on just on the modernization of cyber procurement for the next 20 seconds?
Well, I mean, as I mentioned, there were sort of those three things. I don't want to reiterate them more than I already have, but again, concept of umbrella projects where there's a big chunk of funding and you can allocate it to sub-projects, meaning I could buy various technologies, try it out, and integrate it into my enterprise in a very expedient manner. That funding doesn't have to go continuously up and through Treasury Board or various approval levels. So once I get a base chunk of funding, I can start allocating it through projects. And then lastly, this fast-tracked process by which if it meets a number of criteria that we believe is good economically and good security-wise, that we can procure it in an agile manner without having to go through all 200 and some steps to make that happen.
Thank you, Mr. Kelly. Ms. O'Connell, 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm going to start, Ms. Rachel, or Kristen. Forget it. I can't do
Perfect, Kristen.
Thank you. You spoke about in the private sector and kind of governments working with private sector. But we've also heard testimony that there can be challenges as well, that in the private sector, they also are not necessarily inclined to share with governments when there has been a security breach, and there may be a reason for that. There could be, trade secrets involved, or they don't want their customers or board members to know that there are vulnerabilities. So with that being said, if there is a role for government to help or do a better job in kind of that coordination, how do you then recommend or propose that we bring private sector along to also be more open and transparent with potential breaches? Because that would also help government in preparing of, what's out there and what threats exist.
You're very right. You've got sticks and carrots. I'd like to look at it that way. In some cases, the sticks could be compelling businesses to disclose their breaches. And, most businesses that we talk to say, as long as we are involved with how that would occur, where the information would go, and that it is done in a proactive way where our brand or our business is not damaged in the process. In other words, you flip the lens and say, proactive disclosure is a good thing. No one should be ashamed that they are breached because it's only a matter of time. So you frame it in that way, and then you say, when you proactively disclose to us, the return that you will get from that is that you will get others' vulnerabilities so that you can become a better business. So it's a quid pro quo type of relationship. And I think those are the missing pieces, right? If you want to compel, you need to invite business in to figure out how to do that in an effective way that doesn't damage their business. In the same vein, you're going to be sharing that information back, which is something that we want, which will make us better and more secure in the overall ecosystem.
And then in your opening statement, you mentioned, I believe it was the London example or in the UK, there is an example of...
UK 100?
Yes, thank you. I was just curious, could you perhaps elaborate a little bit more on what that looks like and how old is it? Is it kind of new in its inception, or how could we emulate maybe some of the best parts of that? Could you maybe elaborate on that example?
Yeah, so it's a collaborative model. It's not so new anymore. Okay. Essentially, it's a program that helps solve sort of short-term labor supply shortages for specialized talent. Industry puts staff into the National Security Cyber Center. So that would be on their team. So that would be like us placing our resources into CSE, for example. And they do that on a part-time basis. And there is no separation between the industrial partners, meaning that these industrial partners could be competitors at some point in time, but when they come and they moonlight into the NCSC, they are doing so together with government staff on a neutral territory on a non-transactional basis. So they're not paid for that activity for the common good of the UK national security. And these individuals in the private sector can do everything from drafting white papers to developing software to being the liaison between their organization and the government entity on threats and incursions that are going on. So it's a national type of activity.
Thank you. Okay, perfect. Do you think that, just following up on that, in the UK, when I was on the finance committee and we did our annual review of the anti-money laundering study, and we traveled to the UK, and we heard that there's a different culture, especially when it comes to this openness and security, because there are quite frequently more terrorist attacks localized. And so there's more of an acceptance within the public. Even, for example, registries for mortgages are quite common. But in Canada, and I would say maybe even North America, the culture for kind of that information is a little bit trickier to convince Canadians kind of open in that measure. Do you have any thoughts on that? I think
that's a very true statement, and we see that kind of urgency all the time, right? EU is in the theater of war right now, and Canadians, I think, while we sort of feel it, we don't feel it to any great extent. It's one of the reasons why we say, if there is a portion of the population or a portion of the business community that is probably more wired to be a little bit more accepting of those kinds of things, it is the defense industrial base, right, by nature.
Unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there. There's no chance we're going to make time here. 2.5 minutes, Madame Normandine.
Merci beaucoup. Peut-être
Thank you very much, Ms. Ciaffarani. On the CCAMC that you spoke about, you mentioned that Canada is not using its own standard, that we should use that one instead. To your knowledge, is Canada working on its own standard or not?
Is right now studying CMMC as so the embassy in the Canadian embassy in the United States is actually actively monitoring and working on and to some extent D&D and public safety are looking at, and NPSBC actually are looking at that standard. The challenge is they're trying to understand whether they need specific Canadianizations to the standard. We believe if we do that, developing the Canadianized portions of the standard will A, create a different standard. B, it will mean that Canadian companies have to have two standards, which increase costs. And C, if we don't get it right, the Americans could be moving forward and Canadian companies could be waiting for the Canadian standard and therefore be left behind when it comes out in procurements. So there's that sense of urgency. They are working on it. We have a Pathfinder program right now that is trying to pull Canadian businesses in to actually participate in the American standard as it goes through.
Monsieur Callan.
Mr. Cullen, a question for you. You spoke of quantic computers, which can outgame security in many cases. I'd like you to tell us about the speed, how urgent this and the obtention of this counter equipment or strategies would be. And rated. Go ahead.
Already too late in that there's an attack that they call harvest and decrypt, which is if someone gets inside of your system and they can grab blobs of encrypted data and just store them, then sometime in the future when they have a quantum computer, they can open that up. And so for secrets that will still be valuable in 10 years, let's say, like military secrets or advanced industrial secrets, those things may already be lost. For other secrets, maybe not, but it is very urgent that we get post-quantum cryptography in place really as soon as we can.
Thank you, Ms. Normandine. 2.5 minutes, Ms. Masson.
Obviously, one of the things that's plaguing all industry in Canada and around the world is that labor side and that human resource side of development. Is Canada doing enough at that post-secondary education level? And this is directed to you, Ms. Farani, that to train those future needs. And you had spoken about that UK model, but in terms of that sharing of personnel, of that going back and forth, are we doing enough within colleges, universities, to ensure that we have the people going forward that actually are building these systems, that are working within these systems at all? And what could we do to make that better?
It's hard because stepping out of my swim lane a little bit because I'm not really in the university models or in high school anymore, I guess. But I do think across Canada we understand that there is a talent shortage. We also understand, I think, that we're a little bit shy about being, I think, directive in terms of incentives for, let's say, pushing certain classes of study or areas where we want to develop talent to have it come out the other side. Meaning, we don't really do things like say, you can get a greater or bigger bursary if you go into this particular area of study, right? We want to encourage all Canadians to have equal access to education, post-secondary education, university education. So we're not very directive about what pipelines we want that education to occur in, so that we can develop the talent for the future, right? I do think we could do more as a nation to have potentially incentive programs around directing education and talent into a variety of swim lanes, if you will, to be able to create the next generation of individuals around the areas that we believe are critical for the country. But that comes down to setting national priorities about where you want your talent base to emerge.
Thank you, Ms. Masson. Mr. Bazan, 5 minutes.
our witnesses for being here, and it's great to see Ms. Jen Ferrani here again. I would just follow up on what Ms. Matheson was just saying, and you mentioned the difficulty in getting people the national security clearances and top secret clearances. And when we have a shortage in the workforce, that becomes even more difficult. In discussions around Bill C-26 right now, Business Council of Canada is saying that we're short 26,000 people in the cybersecurity industry as it is right now, unfilled positions. So aside from the point of trying to produce more of those people here through our education system, would it be appropriate to employ foreign nationals who are coming from Five Eye Nation partners and have been approved through their processes?
Well, I mean, I think you'd have to do, your appropriate due diligence and screening to ensure that they would be trusted partners. First and foremost, before we would go down that path, what I would say is, you've got a lot of veterans leaving national defense and security agencies and otherwise that have security clearances that the day they walk out the door, they lose that clearance and it takes them 2 years or a year and a half to get it back. So maybe we would want to look inside to expedite the processes and the barriers that currently exist, first and foremost. And then, yes, it could be, certainly a possibility to look at individuals from most assuredly the Five Eyes, our Five Eyes partners, to be able to provide competency and talent within our own country.
Yeah, I love that suggestion. We definitely need to empower our veterans as they're exiting the Canadian Armed Forces, and I also agree with you. That's a perfect place for them to take on their new public life and as a private citizen is in the cyber world at an industrial level with telecoms, but also with the defense industries. Now, you did talk about, holistic approach, collective cybersecurity. We hear of stories in the past from American sources that, certain technologies have been hacked into by going down, accessing third-party providers that might have access to schematics of things like F-35s or cruise missiles that have been then proliferated on the global scene by our adversaries. Has the Government of Canada been serious enough about that type of collective defense to ensure that we are trying to provide a most secure system possible that, everybody from the government workplace to the primary contractor to the subcontractors to all employees are doing everything possible to protect that intel?
I think we've been very, as we said, we've been quite slow at it. Certainly the agencies, and even to some extent, national defense, have frequently, our siloed approach means we look after ourselves, right? So the agencies look after the government, the CAF looks after the CAF, and industry, well, you look after yourself. And what we're learning is that approach that we use, it's not working. So if we want to secure supply chains from the lowest common denominator, which is where a lot of the incursions occur because they are the most vulnerable, meaning the small business or the small business provider that may or may not have the equipment or skills to be able to do the cyber hygiene at the level necessary, then you have to create those institutions or agencies or outreach to be able to get them to be more cyber aware and to have the appropriate protection. So make those protections available to them, help protect those companies, and incentivize them. And incentivizing can be that stick and carrot, meaning if you want to do business with the Canadian government, if you want to do business in the supply chains, you need to get your CMMC certification, for example. There may be regulations that we have to impose on companies in order to be able to up our game with the quid pro quo of once you're inside the tent, you're inside the tent.
So how many Canadian suppliers of cybersecurity, both from the services side as well as from the infrastructure side, are currently competitive on the global scene? You mentioned that we do encryption and penetration well. What do we do well and is something that is valued by our partners, particularly within NORAD, but for sure within Five Eyes?
Well, like I said,
Very briefly, please.
about 25% of the industry, and 60% of it is along that mission assurance. So 60% of 25%, and please don't ask me to do math because I'm an English major. But that portion is actively engaged in government contracts of our Five Eyes partners.
Thank you, Mr. Bazan. Mr. Fisher, final 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to our witnesses for being here today. We've been looking at the cybersecurity risk to critical infrastructure and in the context of cyber warfare and threats to Canada's defence and security. Now, manufacturing is one of the 10 critical infrastructure sectors identified by public safety. Mr. Callan, how does defence manufacturing represent a target for foreign state-backed cyber intrusions?
Yeah, absolutely it does. So defense manufacturing is critical to the defense infrastructure. And if you can go poison those processes, you can hurt it. You furthermore can steal secrets. Stealing secrets is a big one, right? There's a lot to be gained there, and it will be gained for a long time. It has to do with plans for the future, existing provisioning capacity, and all of those things are very valuable as targets for what we call an advanced persistent threat, a state-sponsored actor from somebody who might want to hurt Canada, and we can imagine who that would be. And, you know, to the degree that the government is a target, it is, but also the organizations, the private contractors who provide to the government can be targets as well. And that's another way that the state-sponsored actors can get the information they're trying to get.
Can you give me some examples of how industry is working or planning to work towards mitigating this risk?
So there is a vast raft of strategies and technologies that are needed. One of the things to understand is that you really have to build a security fortress, and any way in is a way in. And so you have to look for complete comprehensive coverage while the attacker just needs to find one gap or one hole or one vulnerability. And as we mentioned, this could be things like social engineering attacks. This could be things like inadequate encryption. This could be things like firewalls and email protections that are not quite in place. So it's very complex. And there are professionals who dedicate their entire lives to understanding and staying current on these activities, and there are entire departments that focus on this, and there need to be.
Sia Ferrani, welcome back. You used the term cybersecurity as a team sport. I'm a big supporter of partnerships, a big supporter of working together. What opportunities, and you've touched on this a little bit, but maybe you can wrap this up in a bow. What opportunities exist for Canadian cybersecurity firms, traditional defense industry partners, and government to work together to better protect manufacturing and our supply chains?
Well, I mean, as we talked about, we're 85% of the critical infrastructure in this country is actually owned and operated by the private sector. So we have a very important role in securing our own infrastructure, to keeping everyone safe, right? Secondly, we have talent and expertise within our organizations, and are continuously developing and innovating so we can bring that competency to the agencies in order to keep them on the bleeding edge of what is available to protect Canada and Canadian society as well. So it's that exchange, let's call it that collaborative exchange where we can all be better as a nation if we're willing to open up a little bit to each other.
You crammed a lot in your opening 5-minute comments, and you talked about the cybersecurity standard, the global standard, or the need for a global standard.
CMMC, yeah.
Right. So Canada's looking at, is Canada looking at, and Madame Normandin, I think, touched on this a little bit, is Canada looking at joining a global standard or following the American standard, or is that what you're suggesting that we do?
So they're studying the American standard that is going through the process of becoming a standard. It will be imposed on us. It will be imposed on anyone who wants a piece of a DoD contract in the near future or in the future. So we're looking at it from we're in that supply chain, so we are going to have to use it anyway. We're going to have to make sure that the industry is in line with it and has adopted it. But secondly, do we want to adopt it in Canada? So national defense, for example, would make reference to that standard for its own procurement of products and services. And does it need to be the standard by reference, meaning exactly what the Americans have? Or is there something particular that we have to add for Canada?
Thank you.
Mr. Fisher. Before I suspend, I just wanted to get some clarification on your comment about declassification. I've been privileged to have been briefed on secret stuff, and I've wondered at time to time whether I've already read this in the Globe and Mail somewhere. It does strike me as we have an excessively cautious view of what constitutes classified information. So I don't know how much thinking you've done about this, but I'd be interested in 30 seconds worth of your thoughts on this matter.
I haven't delved deep into the subject, but I would concur with your assessment. I think classifying things initially became a way that people with that information kept value. And so by transferring that value, you have to ask, what am I bringing to the table again? We also have a fear in this country of, what will people do with that information, and can it come back to harm us? I think Canadians by nature and the government institutions that go with it are a bit more risk averse than our allies are. And that perhaps comes from the fact that we don't feel like we are in risky situations very often where we need to take risk. So I think it's kind of a perpetrating model, and it's not getting us as far as we need to get. And I think it, requires reflection. Do we need to classify all the things that we need to classify? And can more people have access to information? And can more information be declassified? So as Canadians, we become smarter, better, and more nuanced about what's going on. And it's not about making us afraid. It's about making us more educated.
Yeah, well put. We are in a very much different threat environment, even in the last 12 months. And so I am... I'll be interested in your thoughts in the future, but Ms. Chan, Ms. Chanfarani and Mr. Callan, I appreciate your willingness to come before the committee. Both of you have shared your thoughts with the committee, and it will inform our studies. With that, we will suspend and re-empanel as soon as Professor Leapark is available. Whatever technical issues that need to be solved. Professor Luprick is online. He would usually have a 5-minute opening statement, but being the talented individual that he is and the time constraints that we have, I'll ask him to be as compact on his 5-minute statement as he possibly can be. So now we've lost him.
Oh, non.
Oh, okay.
Monsieur le Président, vous m'entendez?
Wait.
Can you hear me now, Mr. Chairman? Very good. Thank you. I will make my presentation in English, but I'll be pleased to answer any questions in either English or French.
It to you beforehand, so I will skip some parts of the statement. Harvard University's Belfer Center Cyber Power Index ranks Canada in 8th place as a comprehensive global cyber power. The CPI characterizes Canada as a high-intent, low-capacity cyber power with notable strengths in cyber defense, cyber norms development initiative, and surveillance. By contrast, Canada's intent and capability to conduct cyber-enhanced foreign intelligence and offensive cyber operations places it in the middle of the CPI pack, lagging Russia and China and its Five Eyes partners, in particular the US and the UK, as well as the Netherlands and Israel. On the one hand, CPI's evaluation of Canada reflects 2 decades of Canadian cybersecurity initiatives. On the other hand, the ranking shows that Canada has a strategic cyber deficit. For 20 years, cyber diplomacy has largely failed to generate broad agreement on international norms to constrain malicious behavior by state-based and state-tolerated actors in cyberspace. To deter and constrain bad behavior, Western states need to engage using active and offensive cyber measures. This is what the US doctrine of persistent engagement has been enabling since 2018. However, no US ally comes close to matching US resources and capabilities. The 2019 passage of C-59 expanded the role Impact Canada could have in cyberspace by authorizing CSE to conduct offensive cyber operations. The addition of these capabilities to CSA's mandates was hailed as a major step, In theory, the combination of foreign intelligence, active cyber operations, and defensive cyber operations mandates enables the full spectrum of cyber espionage, sabotage, and subversion operations. Canada now has the capacity, but it lacks political will to demonstrate independent international leadership to reduce instability and uncertainty in cyberspace. I propose a cyber doctrine of functional engagement to bolster tacitly accepted norms, cyber norms. Regularly employing cyber capabilities is the most effective way for Canada to reduce uncertainty in cyberspace and limit threats to its national interests. Due to Canada's resource constraints and limited foreign policy ambitions, functional engagement prescribes that Canada employ the full range of its cyber capabilities to establish and reinforce a limited set of clearly defined and communicated focal points to deter and constrain unacceptable behavior. Continuously and globally employing cyber capabilities to change the overall balance of power in the international system. Functional engagement calls for Canada to employ its cyber capabilities more narrowly in specific instances when a malicious cyber actor conducts activity that is antithetical to Canada's focal points, such as directly degrading Canadian sovereignty and the security of its people, degrading or subverting international law and the integrity of international electoral or democratic institutions, and undermining Canada's economic security, competitiveness, and prosperity. The proposed cyber doctrine of functional engagement seeks to shape adversarial behavior cumulatively by strengthening tacitly accepted cyber norms within the limited resources and unique character of Canada's historical leadership on foreign policy niches as a traditional middle power. Je vous remercie de votre attention.
Thank you. First 6 minutes, Ms. Gallant.
CSIS has identified so-called smart cities as emerging threats, especially for the PRC diaspora. How could these ventures put our national defense at risk?
How could smart cities put our national defense at risk?
If they
Is that
could.
the question,
Yes.
Ms. Gallant?
Yes. Yes.
So the premise of smart cities is their interconnectedness and the ability to track both the content and the connections of people within that city. And so this is similar to the problem that, for instance, TikTok poses on a micro level, which is that an adversarial actor can learn a lot about people, even if they cannot read their content, by understanding the edges that connect different nodes. That is to say, for instance, how often you, Ms. Gallant, are communicating with someone else in your network. In addition, the ability to extract that data would allow an actor who can decrypt it through quantum or more primitive measures to then build a very comprehensive picture of your behavior, Ms. Gallant, and then potentially, for instance, deploy misinformation and disinformation campaigns that are deliberately and intentionally targeted to your specific behavior in order, for instance, to influence both your current behavior as well as collecting that data over many years and then influencing your behavior in the future. And so that is the concern with TikTok, both the ability to influence the generation now, as well as by keeping data on those individuals, adversarial actors attempting to influence their behavior once they become voting populations.
Okay. So a Defense Construction Canada contractor recently suffered a ransom attack. How, if at all, could this impact our national defense? And are there measures that we should be taking to better protect our defense and security organizations?
Well, Ms. Gallant, I don't know what car you drive. I drive a minivan. It's about a dozen years old. Think about much of what's happening in terms of our networks within the government of Canada as driving an old car. We are driving on old infrastructure where the government has not sufficiently invested in the actual infrastructure itself. In addition, so this is the cybersecurity part of the challenge that we face. The other is the cyber domain part, which is the behavior, the risky behavior that is created by individuals who click on links, as was likely the case in this Defence Construction Canada contract, and then inadvertently end up spilling information or making networks vulnerable. However, in the previous session, we had had a conversation, you had a conversation about classification. And one of the things we do in Canada is consistently and vastly overclassify material instead of, we probably, 90% of the material we classify, we probably don't need to classify. But the 10% of material that remains, we absolutely need to protect at all costs. And so what we are currently doing is we're classifying way too broadly instead of targeting our protection and our resources to make sure that those elements that must never reach the outside are actually protected. And recent discussions over leaks show that indeed we have a lot of work to do.
Okay, earlier today, we heard how some encrypted technology, messaging plans could have been stolen without our knowledge already, and at some point in the future, when the quantum computers available could be it could be decrypted and secret plans, technology could be revealed, especially as it applies to our missile technology, et cetera. What should we be doing now, and what kind of measures should we be taking in the meantime to protect the sensitive data? But what can we do now so that when these quantum realities actually take place, that the vulnerabilities aren't as exposed and we are better protected overall?
It is a very good question, Madame Gallant, because you can imagine that a hostile social credit system for its 1.4 billion people would have the capabilities of building out that system for the rest of the global population. And Madame Gallant, if I was a betting man, I would be saying that particular country has already built out a fairly sophisticated profile on yourself as well as your digital communications and your own data. And so I think it is very critical, precisely as you say, that we think very carefully, for instance, about what sort of data we might inadvertently be sharing. Very recently, Australia decided to pull out tens of thousands of Chinese-made products out of government buildings and government networks for the concern of the sort of surveillance capabilities it might pose. And certainly quantum will be a significant leap. But my best understanding, although this is not my area of expertise, is that it will be a little bit like Big Blue. We're not going to go from one day to the next with this capability. There will be somewhat of an off-ramp, but certainly this is a future for which we need to prepare, because the encryption mechanisms that we have in place today would not protect us in that future.
Thank you, Ms. Gallant. Before I call on Madame Lambropoulos, you want Professor Liebrecht to move the mic up or down? Up a little bit. If you would do that, please. Thank you. Madame Lambropoulos.
Thanks, Chair. I'd like to thank you, Professor, for being with us today and to answer some of our questions. So I guess my first question is, what does the international cyber governance regime currently look like in terms of international laws and norms governing state behavior? You mentioned in your opening remarks that the U.S., no other country comes anywhere near in terms of ability when it comes to offensive cyber measures. And you also said that Canada does have the capacity because of Bill C-59, but that we don't necessarily have the political will. So I'm wondering if you can tell us, in your perspective, what can Canada do along with its allies in order to strengthen this rules-based international order in the cyber domain?
It's a great question. And we've tried for 20 years to build norms and consensus around this, and we've made very little progress within the UN, within other bodies. And so what you need to understand is there are people who believe in the liberal rules-based international order, and that's about 57 countries. There are countries that are agnostic, and there's a subset of countries that simply does not believe in that order. And so we will never get an international governance, cyber governance regime, at least not in the foreseeable future. But we can force hostile actors to be norms if they know, so we deter them from bad behavior, if they know that the United States and its allies lays out very clear red lines and that there will be serious repercussions for that actor, whether in cyberspace or kinetic through sanctions or otherwise, for crossing those lines. And my opening statement lays out precisely that sort of mechanism. However, the government of Canada has been extremely reticent at using the powers that were given to CSE in Bill 59, in C-59, once the Act received royal assent. And so the challenge is then, what is the point of providing those powers if we're not actually going to use them to advance our interests? Canada has always prided itself of being a country that builds and then enforces international norms and rules. But when it comes to cyberspace, by not using those powers, we're doing effectively exactly the opposite. And so now that we have those powers, we also need to use them to defend our interests and our allies' interests. And the reason we need to use them is because this is a very particular role for the state to play, because private sector actors and other public sector actors do not have active and offensive capabilities that they can employ. Only the state can deploy those capabilities. So only the state can be proactive in either interdicting or, if need be, in cyberspace, also perhaps sabotaging capabilities of state-based or state-tolerated malicious actors.
Okay, thank you.
Emmanuel, just a brief second. Professor Lieber, if you could just mute yourself when you're not speaking, I appreciate that doesn't it may be a bit difficult, but if you could just do that, it will help with the quality of the transmission. Okay, Emmanuel, go ahead.
Thanks. I appreciate your response, and I'm wondering, because I'm not super familiar with Bill C-59, but if you can let us know if there are any gaps that currently exist in that bill that do create a difference, let's say, between our capabilities and that of the U.S. if it were to become strengthened in times of need in the future. In what ways can it be strengthened?
So it's not about strengthening the bill. It's about making sure that we use the capabilities we have effectively. So the U.S. has vast capabilities, which it uses on a regular basis, in part to prevent a change in the international balance of power. That is not primarily Canada's objective, although Canada's objective is inherently to uphold the status quo. But Canada, as outlined in the last paragraph of my statement, could deal with very clear focal points of red lines that Canada will not tolerate, and where adversaries will know that Canada will deploy, either alone or with its allies, these active or offensive measures as provided for in Bill 59. The problem is that Canada has not been willing to, by and large, engage in these measures, with some exceptions of hunt forward teams when it comes, for instance, to issues such as those of Ukraine. And so Canada needs to be a bit more bolder in how it uses the powers that the agencies have been granted to defend Canadian interests.
Would you say that there is a benefit to acting fast before something major happens, of course, or do we lose some of the ability to respond to a threat if we wait longer?
You're on mute,
You're on
Christian.
mute.
It is a fantastic question, and it hits the nail on the head. The problem with current political decision-making processes, not with respect to any particular government in this country, but for years, has been that we dither too long to make key decisions where we need to provide political authority, authorization, and direction. The longer we wait, the narrower your margin for maneuver gets, and the fewer your options in the toolbox that we have. So we need decision-making processes that are more agile, and we need political decision-making processes that are faster in order to maximize the options available politically to the government and the instruments in terms of operations to achieve the effect that the government intends.
Thank you, Madam Lombropoulos. Madam Normandine, 6 minutes, please.
Merci, Professeur Lepruch.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lepruch. It's always good to have you. Now, you talked about agnostic platforms. Some states are completely against international order of government and rules. I'd like to hear your opinion on the, China, Russia, DPRK. They have their own interests, of course, but they offer a threat. Is there cooperation between those countries? And perhaps there could be two fronts created, the Allies, if you will, Five Eyes, and still cooperate among each other and identify the others as an opposition group. Well, that's an excellent question. This addresses the political culture and the strategic position of these two groups of countries. In the Middle East, for example, Iran is there. And they don't aim at the U.S. or Canada or European nations specifically, but DPRK, their main concern is to steal money, whether it's currency or Bitcoin, in order to continue with their malfeasance. Russia has global aspirations, but the difference with China and Russia is that they have a lot of capacity. And they have the patience to develop these strategies to optimize certain objectives. Solar winds, for example, the infiltration of solar winds, I should say, about 2 years ago, was an attempt took 12 to 18 months to develop and implement, and 1,000 individuals perhaps to develop all the necessary components to the attack. These actors have a high level of capacity, and they stand above many other nations. Consequently, we need measures, active, offensive, proactive measures to dissuade them from deploying these measures that go against our interests. While they're particularly different, these actors, we don't expect any cooperation between them and among them, do you think? We shouldn't look at that as a short-term or medium-term threat? Well, there's always tactical collaboration in international politics. China and Russia have begun to cooperate a little bit more closely than in the past, but they don't cooperate when it's not in individual interests. Fundamentally, they don't trust each other. In the long term, I'm not worried about that situation too much, particularly in regards to China. China has enough capacity to act on its own, to ensure, to attain its objectives or to try to fulfill its malfeasance. Good, thank you. We work in close cooperation with a number of other countries. Does not this bring with it a risk that we become a little bit dependent on these other countries, rather than, mind our own garden, as it were, and our own objectives? Is there not a bit of a danger there, a risk, that we will never, ever be autonomous and independent unless we work with other countries? It's not a risk, madame. It is a reality. It's a fact. That's what's going on today. Canada does not have the capacity in a number of domains to be taken seriously by other partners of the Five Eyes, in particular US, UK, and Australia. So we are excluded from certain measures of cooperation, whether it's cyber efforts or others. Canadian capacity is unable to attain a level for that total global or collective. We have to invest and increase our state abilities in cyber activities. Thank you very much. We know that in Quebec we have a minister responsible for cyber and digital efforts. Is there a counterpart? Do you have an advisory council or a group of some sort in cyber? And if it doesn't exist, should we not create it as quickly as possible? I've had the pleasure of having dealt with a number of the members of this Quebec team that you talk about. I admire what they're doing, and I think the federal government could learn from that example. The federal government, do have capacities which is larger than any specific individual province, and the opportunity to cooperate intergovernmentally, no matter the order of government, as is the case in Australia, the Australia Signals Directorate, or the CSC in Canada, of course. We have offices and contacts with the Australians. There is a possibility in that regard for Canada to be much more active. A lot of countries have cyber ambassadors. The Nordic countries, we do not have one. The United States has one. It would be one way to perceive and to understand the cyber world, as it were, and update ourselves.
6 minutes, Ms. Madison.
Thank you, Professor, for joining us again on this committee. I wanted to dig in a little bit back to, I think, your conversation with Ms. Gallant. You were going into a lot of that detail about TikTok and the algorithms that are developed and the mining for that kind of information, their influential ability. Would you argue, of course, though, that exists across all social media platforms, whether it be Facebook or Google or any of the others?
Madame Matheson, donc, I wrote a book on this, Intelligence as Democratic Statecraft, so it's a great question. Sure, but there are considerable differences here. Even though private sector, I had for years warned Canadians when they were very concerned about surveillance by the Canadian state that they might want to be more concerned about surveillance by private sector companies than the Canadian state because there are nonetheless considerable safeguards and accountability and transparency processes in place for state surveillance that are not in place for the private sector. But in the case of TikTok, of course, we're talking about a country that not only has no safeguards for either state surveillance or private sector surveillance, but that has actively, even just very recently, reinforced its laws requiring private sector companies to share data without any sort of legal or judicial sort of authorization, simply at the behest of the government, and moreover has reinforced the presence of the Communist Party of China in all Chinese enterprises. And so you cannot in China distinguish between the private sector and the public sector the way you would, for instance, in North America. And so to say that the risk is the same across the private sector would be a fundamental misunderstanding of the ecosystem in which private sector companies operate in China and their relationship with the Chinese regime.
Okay, absolutely understood on that point. It's more about if you're talking about overall in terms of social media platforms and that private sector draw or them being within the private sector, ultimately they have a specific goal that a government needs to monitor. So how how is it that the government of Canada would better create laws to protect people against a lot of these algorithms, whether they're mining for secrets, they're mining for more money, they're mining to manipulate people in the way that they go. I mean, certainly people can go down a rabbit hole on Facebook in terms of misinformation and disinformation.
You're muted.
Facebook is a great example, Ms. Matheson. Look at the joint investigation by the Office of the Privacy and Information and Privacy Commissioner of British Columbia and the Federal Privacy Commissioner. The problem is that currently there are very, very limited tools for the federal government to enforce measures against companies that do not follow Canadian rules. And so the question I think the committee might want to ask itself, what opportunities exist and what must be done in terms of government enforcement measures, but also what incentives through tax incentives, regulation, and so forth that may provide opportunities for the government to act. And I think within very short order, you will see a report by the Canadian Council of Academies on public safety in the digital age that will provide very concrete measures on some of this conversation.
Thank you for that. I did want to also kind of go back to your comments around that streamlining of governments, those within power. Sorry, can you hear me? Am I coming through? I don't.
Sure. Yeah, he froze. No, he didn't freeze. He blinked. He's Garrettson. Okay, thank you. Okay. Yes.
Okay, we're good.
Professor Liebrecht, are you able to respond at this point?
Well, let me finish my question. Can I finish my question, Chair?
Okay.
I missed the question, Monsieur le Président.
Okay. So just to go back in terms of that streamlining of governments making those key decisions, the inefficiencies and ensuring that governments have those powers to do so. Could you also sort of talk about the flip side potentially of that in terms of, I mean, some of those democratic safeguards exist for a reason, and one of the concerns that I would have, and you can tell me if I'm wrong, absolutely, is that in trying to get at those bad actors, bad state actors that we are concerned about, that we don't become them.
I suppose there's always a concern about state intervention in this domain, in particular when it comes to content. I would say there's probably an opportunity to lay out clear swim lanes for the private sector, to provide more transparency for the private sector, and perhaps also, as I've proposed in the past, that government lays out voluntary certification measures by which companies behave, and they can then get that certification from the government. In return, users know that a company does engage in certain cyber protection, cybersecurity measures, and so forth, for instance, meet certain standards, and at the same time will not use data for other than purposes for which the government intends. And so I think a voluntary certification mechanism would give the consumer much greater confidence and provide an opportunity for government to intervene without being...
Okay, thank you, Ms. Matheson. Colleagues, we have an extension of 10 minutes. However, we're still going to run out of time. So, and I want to devote the last 5 minutes to the budget for the travel. Sorry, we've extended it to 5 to 11. So that gives us 20 minutes, 25 minutes worth of questions.
Mr. Chair, I'm sorry, but the number of us will have to be in question period by then.
That was because of the technical difficulties. We were given this extra time. So is it the will of the committee to go to 5 to 11? Or is it the will of the committee to cut off at 10:45?
Can we split the difference, Mr. Chair?
We can split the difference. I'm fine. Okay, 10 to 11. Are we good with that? Okay. Okay. Well, that pulls the question. Yes. All right, colleagues. I'm going to have to be pretty harsh. This is even at 3 minutes. I'm going to run this very hard. So with that, Mr. Kelly, a very short 3 minutes, please.
So we've heard that our allies and our adversaries can deploy new capabilities in weeks or months where we take years or decades. How does that impact Canada's ability to, as you had urged in earlier testimony, to use the existing powers and offensive capabilities in cyber defense?
Well, I think this is what happens when you don't have a strategy, and especially not a forward-looking strategy. People like myself had argued in 2017 that Strong, Secure, Engage was already outdated on the day that it was released, and I think this has been a premonition that has proven true. And so I think what we need is a bipartisan 15-year strategy to rebuild our national defense, security, and arguably also our intelligence capabilities. And I think it would be helpful if we stopped playing politics and we did like Australia and France, and all parties got together, had a common strategy, and we stuck with that strategy. Then we wouldn't be always constantly falling behind and trying to play catch up on too many fronts.
Okay. How does our procurement bottlenecks, how does that impact our ability to be on top of this issue?
Procurement is a problem. The greater challenge is people. People are the most important asset that the government has, especially in this domain. Very long time to build these skill sets. They are in very high demand, and they regularly get raided by the private sector. And so the committee, I think, could do well to think long and hard about what government can do to ensure that it maintains the capabilities and the people that myself and my colleagues at RMC, for instance, spent many years to build with very exceptional skill sets.
Okay, so that your characterization of Canada driving the equivalent of a 12-year-old car in this area is a matter of both personnel and procurement. It's across the board.
The capabilities we have are very, very good, but they are very limited, both because of the personnel challenges and because of structural, network, equipment, and procurement challenges, as well as challenges in updating policy and regulation, because you might imagine that a national defense organization that is struggling with the shortfalls that it has doesn't have the time to update policy and regulation. So we have a host of challenges across a broad spectrum that cannot be resolved in a matter of weeks or months or even a couple of years.
Thank you, Mr. Kelly. Mr. May, 3 minutes.
Chair, thank you, Dr. Leipert. Pleasure to have you here today. I want to ask you about if we can go back in time about a year ago in the outset of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. There was a lot of conversation and concern that those that supported Ukraine would be targeted by Russia with an onslaught of cyber attacks, and also Ukraine as well. Yet we have seen that this hasn't really materialized in the volume that was predicted, neither for Canada or, frankly, for Ukraine. How do you explain this apparent lack of large-scale cyber warfare in the war between Russia and Ukraine?
I would say that if you look at open source reporting by Microsoft, Russia has actually been more effective at deploying cyber capabilities than it has been given credit for, and integrating those capabilities with kinetic offensive measures on the battlefield. What Russia has learned in Ukraine is that you cannot achieve political objectives on the battlefield through cyberspace, that you need to be able to act kinetically, and so that is where Russia is concentrating its resources. But as you know from repeated warnings from the community establishment, Canada is at considerable risk of hostile, not just state-based actors, but in the Russian case, in particularly state-tolerated actors. And we've simply, ransomware has been mentioned. This has been a major source of revenue for malicious state-tolerated actors, primarily concentrated in Russia.
So in your opinion, the Russian cyber efforts have been effective?
I would say Russia is not to be underestimated because there isn't much of a private sector for the many highly technical skilled individuals in this domain that Russia produces. And so they are disproportionately drawn towards malicious state-tolerated actors, as well as intelligence, military agencies, and the like. Some of these have left the country, but Russia has considerable capabilities that are not to be underestimated, and that we would do well to continue to pay close attention to.
Thank you, Mr. May. Ma'am Normandy, in 1 minute.
Rapidement, en 1 minute, puisque
Quite quickly, you've tweaked my curiosity on cybersecurity. What would be the benefit in having an authority? Well, to do the link between the private sector and the various stakeholders throughout the world who don't necessarily find themselves in a favorable country, but it might be a distributed kind of service, to have direct contact with those actors. If we had a cyber ambassador, it would perhaps access more information for the government. And the Canadian government does not have enough open intel from and among the interested stakeholders, private or public. And we should build this network, this information, these contacts with these actors who are, in many cases, much more powerful than some of these middle states.
Matheson.
Thank you. So, Mr. Lebrecht, you had talked about the dangers of China and its relationship with TikTok and the release of information. I just wanted you to comment on the Americans. They have the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act in Section 702 that they're actually discussing right now in terms of being able to get information from Google, Microsoft, Apple, and those companies, as we had discussed before. Can you just talk about that and if that poses a danger in Canada and what we should be looking out for in that regard?
So that is warranted activity that is being discussed. So it still requires an authorization through the rule of law. And there are also safeguards in place with regards to how that information is subsequently used. People will have different views on whether those authorizations and the laws in place are acceptable to them or not, and whether these the oversight and review and accountability and governance mechanisms are sufficient. But certainly that is an important distinction from the way any hostile authoritarian actor operates, where none of those safeguards are in place. And we need to remember that the Americans are at the top of the international security pyramid. They also have objectives that are different than ours in terms of the balance of power. And as I often say, the Americans are our best friends, whether we like it or not.
Yeah. Thank you. Mr. Bazan, 3 minutes.
Didn't think we were going to get around to this. So I want to first of all thank Professor Liebert for joining us today. and knowing that your expertise in this field has helped a lot. We did talk a lot about the regime in Beijing being a risk on our social media, being a risk in hacking into our broader spectrum of services that we have in telecoms here in Canada. But can you also talk to which other nefarious, either transnational criminal organizations and or other countries such as the regime in the Kremlin, how they have or can attack us here at home, and how we actually can quickly not only be compromised, but how can we actually go about securing our own vulnerabilities so that it doesn't happen?
Mr. Brazan, very good question. I think, fundamental challenge that we face is that we have focused on playing defense. And as long as you play defense, by definition, you will never be able to score. That is to say, you cannot win the game. At the very best, you can play to a draw. But when you're dealing with determined, malicious, hostile actors, such as China and Russia, chances are they will score on you. And so this is an opportunity for the government of Canada to be more robust and muscular in demonstrating to those adversaries that certain types of behavior will not be tolerated in cyberspace and that they will draw repercussions, whether those repercussions are in cyberspace or kinetic.
So, Professor Liebert, what we're really talking about here is that we have to be able to shoot the archer rather than deflect the arrows. And so you say government of Canada, but often they're going to be attacking our civilian infrastructure, financial institutions, electricity grids. They're going to go, as we witnessed, especially with the Russians, what they've done in Ukraine, what they've done in Eastern Europe, in their cyber attacks. So is it all solely on the responsibility of the government of Canada to have the ability to attack? Or do we also empower civilian organizations to be able to do it to protect their own infrastructure and Canadians at the same time?
Sure, resilience by critical infrastructure and private sector actors is key. But when they get overwhelmed, not if, but the incidents will come where, for instance, our financial system or one of our banks might find itself overwhelmed by an attack. What mechanisms do we have in place where that bank can call CSE and tell CSE, we are overwhelmed, you need to do something about either disabling that particular attack or perhaps entirely sabotaging the capabilities that are enabling this type of attack in order to safeguard our financial system. And I would say currently we do not have appropriate mechanisms in place where critical infrastructure and private sector actors can escalate and where they know what exactly the thresholds are and what the conditions are under which they can call the government and government will intervene. And that, I think, is critical for a minister and the government to establish so that we can get the timely help in critical moments that in critical infrastructure and private sector will need.
Thank you, Mr. Brazan. Final 3 minutes, Mr. Souza.
Thank you, Chair. And thank you for the testimony. So let's talk about the repercussions then in respect to some of these issues, and how do we then strengthen those norms of responsible behavior? So if I hear you correctly, there's concerns that we may not be adding or effectively challenging the system, yet at the same time, in terms of enforcing it, but at the same time, we're sensitive about a state-sponsored cyber attack that seems to be suggesting is holding some of these countries at bay. And so how does Canada, in association with the Five Eyes, hold countries like Russia or China accountable for their actions? How do you impose that?
You impose that on the one hand by drawing very clear red lines, and on the other hand demonstrating that we are prepared to use the capabilities that we have to enforce against malicious behavior. And traditional middle powers such as Canada have done so in concert with allies and with partners. And that is the strength of our capabilities, because together we still have more and far better and more advanced capabilities than so.
Give us an example of one of those capabilities.
So if you think, for instance, about the NATO intelligence mechanism that is now stood up among a host of allies and partners, that could be used as a coordinating mechanism also on active and offensive cyber measures. But currently we don't have an effective mechanism to coordinate on active and offensive cyber measures outside pretty much of the Five Eyes intelligence community.
So we're at risk because we're not being able to enforce, or we are resisting to enforce it. Yet, what is the U.S. doing, for example, in that case?
We're at risk because we're at risk of the fallacy of composition, because we currently the whole is not greater than the sum of the parts, and so. But the problem for Canada to be able to harness and leverage that ability to cooperate with allies and to work together to establish those norms means that Canada also has to bring considerable capabilities to the table. Because why would people say, sure, Canada, you should have part in drawing the red lines and help us determine what those lines are, when in return we're not willing to deploy the capabilities that we have, or we don't actually have the capabilities or commitments to enforce those red lines. And so just like we have done in the kinetic space, where we have drawn certain red lines of kinetic behavior that is unacceptable by states, we need to do likewise in cyberspace. And that can be done, but the government of Canada has not shown any political will to engage in those conversations with our allies and partners.
Thank you, Mr. Sousa, and I wanted to thank Professor Leipert for hanging in with us over these technical difficulties. Colleagues, that does bring this time to an end. I do, however, you've received the budget for the travel. I need someone to move it. Moved by Mr. May, seconded by Mr. Bazan. Any conversation about it? Seeing none, we'll assume it's passed. We do need some resolution among the parties in order to action this budget. So I'm hoping that will happen over the next little while, because the planning of the time is entirely dependent upon the cooperation of the parties. So all of you can speak to your respective whips. And the final point I wanted to make is that there's going to be Strong, Secure, and Engage 2.0 has just been launched. I appreciate any thinking that you may have over the course of the next week or two to be communicated to see whether the committee wishes to engage in that space. So with that, meeting adjourned.